Molt bona tarda a
Good
totes.
afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm delighted to be with all of you here today. In a webinar organized by LID Barcelona Center for Leadership. Ana Jolonch says the same in Spanish. We're delighted with the participation in this second webinar of LID Barcelona, a Center for Leadership initiative of the Escuela Pia de Barcelona. We cooperate with the UCL, Institute of Education of the University of London, University College London. Many of you, some of you certainly, will have participated in the first edition of the leadership program between LID Barcelona and UCL. We are delighted to have with us this evening a benchmark of our program. We have the pleasure and the great chance to have with us Professor Viviane Robinson. She is here because her book, her publication in Spanish and English, is being presented. Reduce change to increase improvement. I have written the prologue in the Spanish edition and aiming at educational improvement. I'd like to thank Eumo Publishing House, and in particular, I would also like to thank Tone Burgaya because he insisted that this book be published. So thank you ever so much. Thank you all to all the persons who are here today and are participating in this webinar. About 550 people registered from all over the world because we have people from West Africa, from New Zealand, from South America, people like from Bolivia, El Salvador, Paraguay, Brazil, and people from the whole of Spain. And some of my dear colleagues from UCL. The webinar, you will see, it will be split into three parts. The first part, Viviane and I will be carrying out a conversation. I'll launch a few questions. The second one, we'll have the opportunity to receive questions directly from some heads of schools. There'll be questions. And in the third part, you from the chat can launch questions, ask questions for teachers, for Viviane Robinson. From now, the chat is going active. Many of you are sending greetings from your different whereabouts, and you can start asking questions right from the outset. Viviane Robinson is Emeritus Professor of Auckland University, and she's today with us from New Zealand.
Thank you very much for the early start. It's a big pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.
La profesora Robinson es un referente internacional del liderazgo
Professor Robinson is an international leader in leadership and change and improvement.
Es un referente de los procesos de mejora y ella se presenta a sí misma
a benchmark.
las primeras frases del libro diciendo que su objetivo es ayudar a los líderes escolares
school leaders in education
a introducir menos cambios e innovaciones éticas.
Changes,
se propone reducir el cambio y aumentar la mejora.
Change, but increase improvement. That's the whole point.
Precisamente estos días en Cataluña,
precisely here in Catalonia,
Robinson, porque ella quizás no lo sabe, estamos teniendo muchas vagas de profesores,
there are many,
huelgas,
strikes or go slows or industrial action taken by teachers. There are many demonstrations. There's an important crisis going on, and partly due to the latest changes that have been proposed in terms of school calendar, the syllabus. And in the whole of Spain, there have been many different laws, 8 different laws on education since the advent of democracy. And if we look at the performance tables at the European level, we aren't doing too well. We're still way behind, lagging behind. And so I have a question, Professor Robinson. Why are there too many changes? And why don't these changes always lead to improved performance? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that greeting, Anna, and my absolute privilege to be with you at the launch of these translations into Spanish and Catalan. Buenas noches, everybody. It is just such a delight to have people from all around the world participating in this webinar. Now, your question was about why there's so much change in schools and why doesn't it always lead to improvement? Well, as you yourself said, Anna, there's been so many changes with 8 laws since you became a democracy attempting to improve schools, and yet you've just said it hasn't worked out quite as well as politicians and educators themselves would wish. And there are lots of reasons for this, and the ones that are typically talked about are lack of resources, that the professional development for teachers and leaders is not good enough, it's not intensive enough, people haven't been consulted, they feel as if they've been instructed in doing change that they don't necessarily agree with. And all of those explanations are important and often valid. But there is another explanation, and that's the one I've focused on in my book because I think it's been really overlooked. And that is how leaders lead change. In other words, the processes that they use to actually bring about change, hoping, of course, to improve. And so my theory is that as one lot of change comes in and it tends to not achieve the results that people wish for, then passionate educators, what do? They bring in another change and then another change because they are dedicated and passionate about improving outcomes for students. But what they do is they bring in the new reform without studying why the old one didn't work and without studying the practices that they wish to change. In other words, there's too much focus on the change I want to see and not enough focus on understanding the present that we already have. So if the literacy is not as good as people would wish, study the literacy practices in schools now so that you understand why they are happening and why you want to have happening is not happening. So study the things you want to improve before you bring in anything new. And that is, I think, the major pattern that I see in school reform is too much focus on the future, too much focus on the new reform, the innovation, the quick fix that's going to help us all get better literacy results. But unless you have studied what teachers are doing in schools now to teach literacy, reformers and leaders and politicians don't know what is involved in bringing about improvement. They don't know what the current capability of leaders and teachers is in teaching literacy. They don't know the difficulties that those teachers are having in teaching to students' learning needs. They don't know the difficulties of accessing resources, which is often in many countries a really big issue. So that's my in a nutshell, that's my answer to that question. And we keep getting these cycles of failed reforms which burn out leaders and burn out teachers and create cynicism because people are now inquiring into the causes of the difficulties that they're trying to improve.
Muchas gracias, Viviane, por tu respuesta.
Thank you so much, Viviane, for your answer. Just a slight nuance, because I've seen some comments in the chat. and I'm very familiar with your theories. But
yeah.
So you say that reform was not necessarily something essential to improve, right?
Anna, you were saying that it's not essential to improve. Did I misunderstand you?
No. What I mean to say that I've seen in the chat certain people who are saying, but we must change. Change is necessary. We do need change in school.
Yes, but
So,
it is quite easy to change things. That is easy. What is hard is to change things in ways that they improve. So our goal should not be to change things. Our goal should be to improve things. To change things is just to do things differently. And there is a history in education reform of doing things differently that makes no difference in the end to students' outcomes, or in some cases makes it worse. So we should be focusing on how do we make changes that have a much higher probability of improving things. So we should not be celebrating change. We should not be celebrating innovation. We should be celebrating and reaching for improvement.
Sí. Muchas gracias por el...
Thank you very much, Viviane, for clarifying that aspect.
Yeah.
I have another question, Viviane, for you. Viviane, there's much evidence, and you also mentioned that in your book, of the importance of leadership, pedagogical leadership, leadership in schools, and how that has a bearing on improvement in pupils' performance. And we've talked about that for years. But in your research, you say you don't just stop there. You go beyond. You have researched with schools to see what kind of leadership is the most efficient one. And you've established 5 dimensions concerning leadership. Of these 5, there's one which stands out: professional development, training, motivation of teaching staff and teaching teams. That has the best impact on performance. In the chat, there is a question, I'm improvising. What can we do? How can we do these changes without any help, without any assistance? Professionals, teaching professionals, are aware that changes must take place, but they feel disassisted. They feel there's no one there to help them, to take them by the hand and help them. Let me share my experience with my colleagues from LID Barcelona. And recently we have had encounters with many heads all throughout the country, in Bilbao, in Mallorca, and so on. And when we talk to them of the dimensions of Viviane Robinson, which is the one that they give priority to, before actually looking at the research, and when we ask them, they always highlight the 5th dimension, which is a good environment and in the school. And I would like to take advantage of this occasion to ask, could it be that could the context and the environment of the schools, could it make the 5 dimensions vary? Could it have to do with the status that headmasters or heads in schools have compared to other countries with a lot more school autonomy? There's a lot more tradition of pedagogical leadership. So that is a question for you, and let's leave it for there for the moment.
Well, thank you, Anna. Yes, I think that the 5th dimension is about leaders ensuring a safe and orderly environment. So what we traditionally understand as school management fits under that 5th dimension. The most powerful dimension on average is the dimension 3, which is dimension 4, which is the leadership of professional learning and development. If you really want to work with your teachers for improvement, that should be the focus. But of course, you can't focus on that if the school is not orderly and safe. So dimension 5 about school management, having routines work smoothly, is foundational to all the others. But there is another issue as well, which is the tradition of particular cultures and particular jurisdictions. And I've worked in Scandinavia for quite a while. And when I first started working in Scandinavia, perhaps like Spain in some respects as well, there was not a tradition of pedagogical leadership. It was assumed that teachers knew how to teach. The job of the principal was to stay in his or her office and do the budget, look after the property, look after the timetable, meet with officials, and keep out of the classroom. And so that makes it, and if that's what's the expectation in some schools in Spain, then that provides a quite difficult background against which to become a pedagogical leader and to move into the types of leadership that are really needed in order to lift student outcomes. So, but there is some hope for such leaders. And that is that teachers want help. They want help for problems and difficulties that they want help for problems and difficulties occurring in their classroom. And so if leaders can then step into that by helping those teachers, offering help in a non-judgmental way, in a developmental way, then I think they can begin to work in that way of being pedagogical leaders. And it means, of course, that the leaders themselves have to know how to lead in that way. They have to have knowledge of the curriculum, of pedagogy, of assessment. And that will also, as well as the cultural tradition of leadership in their school, that will also prevent them from being pedagogical leaders. So I think that the importance of leaders learning to be instructional leaders and being supported to do it so that they can then step back into their school contexts, some of which have no tradition of this sort of leadership, is important. And so that's a long-term strategy, and I know, Anna, that LID is a part of helping leaders to make that shift. But I just, in conclusion, want to say that is not possible if leaders are constantly attending to fights in the playground, disorganized timetables, absence of teachers. You have to have that foundation of good management, or else nothing else can happen.
Exacto. Se entiende, ¿eh? Si no hay unos...
Yes, of course, unless there's the basics are there, until there's a basic foundation stones, it's really very difficult. So that is essential, right? And I think you also point that out quite robustly in your book. I have another question in the pipeline, which has to do with this possibility of change, which will lead us to improvement. Because in your book, there are two types of approaches. And I understand with so little time, it's difficult to flesh them out in depth. But I'd like to hear you explain within your own words, which will lead us to better understand these two approaches. You talk of an approach which is a bypass, sort of kind of, and another one which will be engagement, right? The engagement. And perhaps could you tell our participants who are here today about these two approaches?
Yes, and I'm going to just share screen and show you some diagrams to help do that. Let me just go to the previous slide. Right. Let me just build this up. The first approach is I call bypass, and bypassing, here's a diagram of what that looks like. Now, the leader has an improvement agenda. That's a leader's job, to have an improvement agenda. And it could be about literacy, or it could be about a management aspect of the school in terms of student behavior or even staff professionalism. And the leader sees what's happening now and creates this agenda and has a vision of what an alternative, a better way of doing things is. And that could be in a reform program, or it could be a new way of teaching literacy. It could be anything. It's just an alternative. And notice that, and then what happens is that the existing way of doing things, which I'm calling a theory of action. So the existing way of teaching literacy is embedded in the teacher's theory of action, their beliefs about how to teach literacy, their practices, and that has consequences. So it's not just a behavior of those teachers, it's an implicit or tacit theory, often taken for granted. The leader's alternative also represents a theory, a belief about if you do this, then teach differently, then literacy outcomes will improve. That's a causal theory. So if we call these two theories in the bypass, the typical approach, the only theory that's talked about is the leaders. And the leader then goes on to persuade the teachers to try it out. This teacher's theory, the theory that informs their current practice, stays tacit and hidden. The only thing you see about it is the teacher's actual behavior, the actual practice. So there's no agreed evaluation about whether or not the leader's alternative is worth trying. It's just try it. Yes, all right, I'll try it. So you get two possible outcomes. The first outcome is that teachers do adapt to the leader's theory. So sometimes this bypass approach to improvement works. And it works when there's not much tension between the teacher's beliefs and way of teaching literacy and what is being suggested by the leader. So when there's not much tension, then that might work. And the teacher might adopt what the leader wants. If there's tension between these two theories, then you will get either compliance or resistance, depending on the power of the leader. Okay? And most educational leaders, they don't want compliance, and they certainly don't want resistance. But it's happened because there has been a persuasive process used. There's been no revealing the teacher's theory and no dialogue between these two theories. This is the alternative, which I spend most of the book talking about, engaging. Leader still has the same improvement agenda. That's the leader's job. Raise the standards, seek better outcomes for students. That's the leader's job. But this time, the leader creates a dialogue between the teacher's theory of action, the way they teach literacy, and the leader's alternative theory. Now, the teacher's theory of action is often implicit, tacit, and it needs some considerable listening and inquiry to put that out on the table. And when my colleagues and I run workshops in this, we teach leaders how to find out, how to discover, reveal collaboratively this theory. And we have videos about how to do that in less than 10 minutes. So there is a dialogue between these two, an examination of not which is better, because we don't know which is better yet, has to be tried. It's an empirical question. But what we want is a dialogue that says, is it worth trying? Do we have sufficient dissatisfaction with the current literacy outcomes, the literacy results, to try it. So we get an agreed evaluation that it's worth trying the alternative. Or we get an agreement not to attempt the alternative. And sometimes this happens because in this dialogue, the leader has discovered that actually it's not literacy that the leader should be focusing on with helping this teacher, but it should be, for example, classroom management. And that until classroom management is in place, then this fancy literacy reform is not going to be possible to be implemented in these teachers' classrooms. Or there is a joint decision to attempt the new literacy strategy, knowing full well how that strategy compares with what the teacher is currently doing and exactly the shifts that that's going to require in teachers' eventual beliefs, but more immediately in their actual practice and in the outcomes that people are looking for. So that's the difference between bypass and engage. And then in most of the book, I illustrate with conversations, transcripts, and explanations how to do this engage work. Anna, I'm just conscious of time. I could go on to the next diagram, or we could just move on.
Quizás pasamos a lo siguiente, porque respecto a esto,
Let's move on to the next one, because when it comes to this, and some of the questions from heads, from there you'll be able to dwell upon them and deepen a bit more, go into more depth, right? Because it is important to actually get a bit more involved in that.
Okay, all right. So this approach, which I've called theory engagement, and that means discovering the theory in the practice you want to improve. That's what theory engagement means. And then having a dialogue between two theories, not a fight between two people, but a dialogue between two theories. The theory that's sustaining the current practice and the theory, the alternative theory. So the starting point is agreement on the problem to be solved. The problem to be solved is we are both dissatisfied with the literacy results. That's all you need. We might completely differ on our view of the causes of those literacy problems, but that's at this point, that's not relevant. What you want in this phase is to get common ground that we're both dissatisfied with these results. And that's enough common ground to then go to phase 2. And in phase 2, the leader works with the teacher to discover how they're teaching literacy at present and why. And the why gets into the beliefs of those teachers and their experience that has led them to teach the way that they are. And if leaders do that well, teachers' trust in their leaders will greatly increase, because instead of being judged for the poor results, the leader has taken the time to inquire into why the teacher is struggling, what actually and why they are teaching the way they are. In that third phase, you then are discussing, is it worth trying an alternative? And the answer to that, if you've done phase 1 and 2 well, should be yes, because you've agreed in phase 1 that there is a problem to be solved. You've agreed that you're both dissatisfied. And then you implement and monitor a new sufficiently shared theory. Now that will iterate. It might be quite tentative, and over time you will learn together how to make it work in that teacher's classroom, or that what you thought was going to be better does not turn out to be better at all. And so it's important to note the arrows, both within these phases and between the phases, because when you get new staff, for example, you might think you're at stage 4, and then you've got to go back to stage 1 because there's new staff members who've come along and they don't know what's happening, and they need to be inducted into phase 1 again. So I just will stop there, Anna, and hope that that's been helpful.
I'm afraid we can't hear Anna. Anna, I'm afraid, has her mic muted. Her microphone is muted. The interpreter cannot hear Anna speaking. The interpreter cannot hear Anna speaking, I'm afraid. Anna's microphone is muted. My apologies, says Anna. My microphone was not lit. Viviane, thanks ever so much for your explanation, your very detailed explanation. As this seems very complex at first viewing, but in the book, there are many examples and conversations where we can clearly see how all this pans out, how these different phases pan out. Again, we can't have long conversations, but if the heads could launch their questions, and Viviane can venture an answer, because we're talking of heads of schools who are familiar with Viviane's theories. They want to work with an engagement approach, and they have issues. So let's start with the first video. We have 3 videos. José Alberto, the head of Al-Andalus school in Andalusia, launches a question. Let's listen to him. Good afternoon. I'm Alberto Martin. I'm head of a state school in Marbella in south of Spain. I thought the book was fantastic. I'd recommend it to all leadership teams. From the reading, a number of challenges came to mind. I'd like to be able to ask Viviane whether attempting to achieve consensus could not be a stumbling block. It could be a break, even mean that we don't move forward at all. And how can we counter resistance to change?
Okay, thank you, Alberto. That's a great question. I think you will have hopefully noticed, as I went through the phases of the engagement approach to leading improvement, is that the agreements are step-by-step agreements. We cannot expect a teacher who is skeptical, who has struggled, to suddenly agree with a leader's bright new idea of how to teach literacy. What we want is agreement phase by phase. Agreement first, that the current results are disappointing and unsatisfactory. This must be a no blame agreement. You do not judge or blame the teacher, because then you will lose trust. So you have that agreement. Then you move to discussing and trying an alternative. And the teacher will perhaps, or teachers, we can do this with groups of teachers, the teachers will have difficulties. They will struggle. They will have some skepticism about whether it's going to work. The leader must listen, must discover the beliefs and the practices that are producing the difficulty, that are constituting the obstacles. Then you go on round those phases, seeking a sufficient agreement. That's the other word that's important, sufficient agreement. sufficient agreement to take the next step, to try it. The teacher doesn't think it's going to work with certain students. She may be right. Let's try it. So the key to being open-minded as a leader about this is to say we have a duty to experiment. We have a duty to try and get the evidence to see what happens. That's what being open-minded means. So that's, I hope, helpful. The other thing is I want to reframe resistance. Resistance for leaders to think of their teachers as resistant brings in that personal conflict, that personal antagonism between leader and teacher. Try to think about that differently. The teacher has a different theory from you, a different theory of practice, a different theory that's guiding their practice. So we have a conflict, perhaps, or certainly a difference between two theories rather than two people. And if you can frame it that way, it becomes less personal as well. Now, should we always arrive at an agreed theory? Depends what stage you're talking about. You are evolving that together. You are co-constructing through trying things, through continued dialogue, through continued collecting evidence. You will arrive eventually at an agreed theory, but you certainly should not be looking for that in the beginning. Anna, do you want to add anything to what I've said?
No, veo que es un proceso, ¿no? Que sobre todo la clave es que es proceso.
See, it's a process. The key is that, the process. And what I take away is dialogue, confidence, trust, and time. We need time to work in this way. And that is what leaders often find lacking, the time to do things.
Yes, well, Anna, if I could just say something about time. When we start working with leaders, they all say they haven't got time. We do two things. One is we model these conversations, and all our videos are less than 10 minutes. So you can reveal a teacher's theory of action, even if you can't observe in the classroom of their literacy teaching. That's ideal, of course, but often you can't. You can, with a detailed, structured sort of interview process or a structured conversation, you can reveal that in less than 10 minutes. The other thing I want to say about time is when leaders have repeated conversations with teachers in which they often describe themselves as making little progress. Those conversations take much more time than one good conversation. The other thing more in a bigger picture of time is we also ask leaders to look at, and with evidence of their schedules, to actually log and look at the way they spend their time, because there is a theory behind the way they spend their time. And sometimes we work with leaders to change the beliefs that drive the way they spend their time. And the last chapter of my book has a case study about how we helped leaders to do that. So that's just something about time. Time is easy to talk about, but you need to drill down as to why people think they don't have time. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not.
Muchas gracias, Viviane.
Thanks very much, Viviane, for that clarification. I think that was important to talk about time, because it's something that constantly comes up when you talk to a group of heads in schools. Let's talk to Esther. She is head of Rosa dels Vents primary school in Mallorca, and she also has a question for Professor Robinson. Let's listen to her. I've been delighted to read Viviane Robinson's book, which has evoked in me many questions and raised challenges. I say, I am the head of a primary center with 107 students where stability of the teaching staff is very difficult to achieve due to vacancies. So I question, how can I work with long-term goals and expectations when there is such a big turnover of staff? Bureaucracy in management of schools often takes time away from what is key, which is pedagogical and leadership work. In the same way that adult persons accompany kids and children, we adults need to be accompanied and to be guided. Do you think we should have a person who is in charge, a facilitator, who would accompany the team to work on the different dimensions of leadership? Would that be a good strategy? What are your views?
Oh, thank you so much, Esther, for taking the time, firstly, to read my book and think about it and ask me that question. I have understand that in many contexts in Spain, rotation of teachers, teacher vacancies, teacher absence, and rotation of leaders is a real challenge. And of course, I don't understand sufficiently the reasons for that rotation policy. But let's just say that's the way it is. How do we, your question, Esther, is about how can you work on long-term goals in that situation? And I suppose the one piece of, the one thought I have about it is that the more turnover of staff, the more important it is that you have really clear written routines and policies so that you can quickly induct new people, so that when you do get new people coming in, that there is a manual about how the assessment practices in the school work. There is a very clear, accessible curriculum frameworks, if not units of work, written down. There is there is an expectation, Esther, that your new staff will use them. They will become familiar with them and they will use them, which is not to say that those manuals and written policies and procedures are perfect. They're probably not. You will be open to revising them in a systematic way. You will be open to feedback from your staff about them, but there will be an expectation that people actually use those agreed policies and procedures. Otherwise, you are constantly reinventing things, and it is extremely difficult, and students are losing opportunities to learn because of this turnover and the instability of staff. So if you are in the audience, Esther, and I don't know whether you are or not, it would be great to just have your reactions maybe in the chat to what I've said, because I suspect that what I have said is somewhat challenging in terms of what I'm implying about the authority of the leader. And I think that this expectation that I'm talking about should be explained to the staff, and the reasons, the educational reasons for it given, so that it doesn't come across as a managerialist, you must comply. The written curriculum and the units of work represent people's best efforts so far to teach well. And so you want your new staff to start with those and then contribute over time to them, of course. The other thing, educational reason for what I'm saying, is that there is quite a lot of evidence that a shared instructional framework is helpful for students, because they don't have to learn with every different teacher what that teacher's approach is to starting a lesson, to homework, to setting work, that actually there is a shared approach to the structure of a lesson. That teachers have planned together, so there is a shared vocabulary. And that is so important, particularly in contexts of instability, which Esther, yours, talked about. Now, you then asked about whether I think there should be a person in charge and a facilitator to accompany the team to work on the different dimensions of leadership. And I wasn't sure, Anna, whether that question was about an external facilitator coming in to work with the team, or whether it's about the head teacher taking that role. I just wasn't sure.
Yo creo que Esther, conociendo también
Esther, knowing the reality of her school, and all the questions are very representative, by the way. They're very representative of the reality in schools here. The lack of stability in teaching staff makes it very difficult to work in a collaborative fashion. Yeah. Because until many years have passed, you do not have, if like, tenure in the school, and the team will change from one year to the next. And when there are people who are very, very good, and you have managed to achieve a very good collaborative climate, suddenly next year they're gone. And that is very frustrating. So this reveals the lack of training and lack of accompanying when you take on the role of head, because there is some initial training, which is fairly minimalistic and centered on management and on bureaucratic and administrative tasks. But aspects which you deal in the book, like coaching and leadership, well, the heads are not properly trained or prepared. And I think she says that a head teacher should have some kind of outside support, right, to be able to carry out his role as a pedagogical leader.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Anna. I think that you've just reinforced the idea that the difficulty of collaboration. So it is so important to capture the wisdom and good practice of people that have been in the school in your written manuals, policies, procedures, curriculum, lesson plans. So important to capture that. In a sense, you're collaborating with people who are absent through the written records. Their wisdom is there with you. And so it should not be lost in that way. But of course it won't work unless you also have the expectation that new people use that wisdom, because that's the school the school policy. The other thing is, yes, of course, Esther, having training in order to lead, especially the pedagogical dimension. You've had training in the fifth dimension. You haven't had much training perhaps in the other four. Then I absolutely agree. And it is wonderful to see organisations like LID in cooperation with University College London offering more of that sort of training. And so over time, building up again the wisdom and the knowledge to be able to build up the capability of leaders in these dimensions, plus changing the policy, the system level policies in order to support the learning and the expectations through the way principals are selected and inducted and developed, that they can actually be pedagogical leaders, which will also require, I think, probably addressing some of the politics of that as well.
Quiero añadir una cosita antes de pasar al
siguiente. Let me add something before moving to the next video, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. LID Barcelona was in Mallorca a short while back. We were with Esther organizing training workshops because in the Balearic Islands, the Balearic regional government has set up a training center for heads. It's a training and research center. Manuel Perello is with us today in this webinar. It is a pioneer center in the whole of Spain because they are going to spend time, resources, and effort to train and accompany of head teachers and leaders. So in that sense, they are pioneers. It's a pilot project in the whole of Spain, in the Balearic Islands. Let's move now, Viviane, to the last question, which comes from Vizcaya in the Basque country. And Aitor Garablay is from the Icostola, and let's listen to him. Hello, Ana. Hello, Viviane. I hope you're well. I'm Aitor Pagalday, head of an Icastola in Amorebieta in Vizcaya, and I have a question, a consultation, if you like, concerning the evaluation of teachers' performance. In a school, we're going to start with this praxis by evaluating a teacher's practice to improve their education project. Where should we start? How can we ensure that teachers see the evaluation of their teaching work as a golden opportunity to improve their teaching practice? And there are teachers who maybe are cagey because they will have gone through bad negative evaluation experiences. So what can we do to bring them back on board again and get them to trust the management of the school and this approach? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Aitor, for this great question. I would start with listening to why the teachers had bad experiences. Just listen to what it is that they found unhelpful, maybe judgmental. What were those bad experiences? Then I would move next to what would make it a good experience, and listen to that. And this is all before I do anything. This is part of setting the scene. And some years back, one of my doctoral students did a thesis on precisely that question. And this is New Zealand, of course. And the answers that the teachers gave were what they wanted was evaluation, or in New Zealand it's called appraisal, or was, that was useful, that gave them feedback that helped them solve the problems of teaching and learning that they experience in their classrooms. So that's what I think you might find that if the teachers will want. And given that, then you take, you're building trust by first of all letting them talk about what they don't want. Then they're talking about what they do want from and with you. And then you work out together how you're going to do this. Now, my suggestion is that you make the evaluation focused on the things that the teachers want help with, not an action research project, not something that I think might be interesting to study or to do. That's something that teachers can do in their graduate study. My preference would be, because this is to do this in a way that helps the students of those teachers. That's a student-centered approach. The adult-centered approach is you do a project that interests you. That's an adult-centered approach. A student-centered approach is, let's focus on something that you're finding difficult in terms of teaching and learning in your class. That has as its end goal helping the teacher help the students. And that's what I would make the focus of the teacher evaluation. In my book, under the leading, teaching and learning dimension, and then dimension 4 as well, I have some questions that I think you might want to look at, the 4 questions that might be a starting point for teacher evaluation. Have a look at those. They're questions about what are the intended learning outcomes. So you're teaching this unit of work. Can the teacher tell you the intended learning outcomes and why they are important? Even more useful is to ask the students, or have the teacher ask the students, if they know what the intended learning outcomes are. So that was the first question. The second question is to what is the teacher's teaching strategies and resources, and how are those going to enable the students to reach those learning outcomes. The third question is about students' engagement with the work, with the tasks. What students' engagement with the tasks? And I mean cognitive engagement, not just behaving well and looking like they're on task. I mean, are they actually thinking about the things that you want them to be thinking about? And the fourth question is about their success in reaching those outcomes. What does the teacher know about the students' understandings and misunderstandings? And the teacher should, through their walking around while they're teaching, through their looking over the shoulder of the students, should be able to say what the current misunderstandings are, and then may need help with how are they actually going to address them. So those 4 questions, which are explained and elaborated in my book on student-centered leadership, those might be a starting point for your appraisal once you've had the previous conversations about the bad experiences that your teachers have had and what they would wish to have happen instead.
Creo que Aitor tiene un buen plan de trabajo ahora.
I see that Aitor has a good working program, a lot of homework. It's fascinating to listen to you, Viviane. Really, it's because it's your approach, Viviane Robinson's approach, is the question and answer, and listening. Active listening is very, very important. It's key. We have some questions in the chat, by the way, but I really do not have that much time. So could you tell us one thing? I've taken out 3 questions. One of them, I'm going to answer them because it has to do with our context, and I'll launch the other 2. Maria Rodriguez from Murcia asks us, are the most suitable people chosen to be leaders? Or those who are leaders, do they have the necessary recognition? I think there's a lot to be done in that field. Education policies must evolve in Spain along the track. And let me tell you that in Catalonia, there is a process of selection. It's a bit more sophisticated, but a lot remains to be done to choose our leaders and make sure that they're the best people. Now, one question from David for you and from Noemi. David asks something which is very interesting, Viviane. What happens when the person resistant to change is the head teacher who is refusing to cooperate? And unfortunately, that does happen, and does happen fairly often. Do you want to answer that one first, or shall I send the other one along as well?
Well, I'll answer that one. There's a couple of questions there, Anna. One is about the recognition of headship and leaders, and I think that it is so important that they are recognized appropriately. I don't know of any evidence that schools improve and in a sustained way without good leadership. So, you know, you can have you can focus on developing teachers and teachers, and that's very important. But in too many schools, teachers are learning new things which are not being appropriately supported by leaders, because the leaders haven't been part of the development, or because the leaders feel marginalized, or that they can't be pedagogical leaders or don't want to be for whatever reason. So I think the importance of leadership is really critical. I think in Spain, you talked briefly with me, Anna, about a history of the importance of democracy, and given a history of fascism, etc. Now, there is no incompatibility between democracy and leadership in schools. And democracy does not mean that you vote on everything in schools, does not mean that you need consensus on everything. It means that you need leaders who are open-minded, willing to be influenced as well as influence others. But it does mean that you take the duties of the role seriously. And the most important duty of a leader is to serve the students, not the staff, not themselves, but to serve the students. That's the most important duty of a leader. And it is very challenging and needs to be acknowledged for the worth and importance of the role that it actually is. And then you had another question, which I've forgotten.
What happens when the person who is resistant to change is the head or the head of the school? This can happen.
Yes, well, you go into the same engagement process. You listen deeply to why they don't want to do what you want them to do. You listen deeply to it. And of course, if you've got a history of alienation, frustration, impatience, that requires considerable skill on your part to do it. But even if you're a subordinate, you are subordinate to that principle, I would want to have a conversation with that principle in which I refrained from criticizing, but tried to understand what that principle was objecting to and understand it in some detail. Then you might discover that there actually is some common ground. You are both dissatisfied with the results, but the principles really opposed to the ministry telling him or her to do something. I don't know, could be all sorts of things. But the first job is to understand the objections. Then if it's a more serious matter, of course, it's in an issue of competence or employment, then you're in the realm of employment law, and then then the superior of the principal needs to be acting.
Continuing with the same example, the last question, and we have a minute, it comes from Noemi, and it says, what happens when you do not reach an agreed theory? When it is impossible to reach that agreement on an agreed theory?
Well, I would ask the questioner, Anna, at what point is she thinking? Is she thinking at the beginning of the process? Because you don't need an agreed theory at the beginning of the process. You need an agreement that the current student outcomes, or whether it's well-being or behavior or literacy, are unsatisfactory. You need agreed dissatisfaction. Okay. Then phase 2 is find out the theory of action of the teachers, parents, whoever's relevant, that is producing or contributing to those outcomes that we both agree are unsatisfactory. Then you craft an alternative to get what you both want. Now, the book takes you through the process, the conversations, the types of skills that you need in order to do that. So and then over time, you will reach an agreed theory. And I'm not talking about a talk theory. I'm talking about an agreed walk theory, an agreed theory of action, not an agreed philosophy of how to teach reading. No, we're not talking about that sort of theory. We're talking about all the time about a theory of action, or what Ardress and Schoen call a theory in use. It's the tacit theory that drives the practice. That's the theory you want to access. And over time, you co-construct new practice with and that means you're co-constructing a new theory of action.
Viviane, el chat
Viviane, the chat is full of expressions of gratitude and enthusiasm to Lid Barcelona for translating the book, but above all for having you here with us, for having written this book, which is going to help people move forward. There are many people say that. There are many expressions which in the chat, which attempt to summarize this experience this afternoon here today. Viviane permanently refers to the need to listen, to understand, to reach out to the other party, to reflect, to ponder, to co-create. Some of them say that, to jointly create. And these messages in these times, in these tough times, and particularly in Europe, with so many difficulties we are facing, to understand, to reach out to others, to attempt to create a better world than the one which is ours. I think that Viviane's messages should help us a lot, not just help the schools, but help all our futures. I don't know, Viviane, whether you'd like to say last few words addressed to the participants in this webinar and school leaders who listened, because this is being recorded in the next few days. Some final message, perhaps, Viviane?
Well, my final message is, first of all, to thank you all for being here, to thank you for your leadership, which I've talked about just how important. I'm passionate about leadership, and I hope you are too, that you stand proud as leaders, and you are unafraid of leading in your contexts. I want to thank Anna and the LID team for their wonderful organization and support of me in this webinar, and encourage you, Anna, I'm very happy if there's particular chat questions that you think I should talk directly with participants about. I'm happy to do that. So thank you so much for being here.
Muchísimas gracias, Viviane.
Thanks ever so much, Viviane, for all your contributions. And also thanks to all those who have participated in this webinar this afternoon, evening. It's very, very early in the morning for Viviane. It's 7 a.m. because somebody in the chat was curious about that. So thanks all of you for being here. And we hope to see you again in future webinars. And Viviane, you are welcome to come to Barcelona. Let's see if that can actually happen in reality sometime soon. Thank you. Lovely. And good evening or good morning.